It's really a privilege to be here, to be part of this wonderful conference. It's really a privilege to be among you, so in this room full of books, dead ones, living ones. It's been a humbling experience so far. I've learned a lot. One of the things I learned how imperfect my paper is, but doing history is a humbling experience, you know. So, yeah, it's great to be here. It's when David informed me a couple of months ago about this conference, there were three things that really excited me. And the first thing was this wonderful place. I thought I really have to visit it, and impressive it is, isn't it? I mean, what is going on here? The second thing that I was excited about is that there was payment for the submission of the abstract. And I'm Dutch, and that was new to me. But I strongly recommend the SNTS, the SBL, the ETS, the CBL to follow this very generous example. Don't you think so? And the third thing was, of course, the topic of the conference. Having finished a dissertation on the so-called linguistic problem of the pastoral epistles, finished about 5 years ago, but I never took the time to really reflect on the implications of my study. And this conference, this topic, it triggered me. I thought, yes, I need to devote time to this very important topic. Well, it's entitled, as David said, Recycling Early Christian Canon Criteria, a recommendation for the use of disputed New Testament writings in church. It consists of 4 parts. You are lucky that the number of pages of the paper is considerably shorter than the number of forms I had to fill in to get access to the US. The question is, who wrote the 27 writings known as the New Testament? Well, in most cases, the opening sections of these writings, start with the introductory matters, in most cases, the opening sections of the writings display the names of their authors. So, Paul, Sosthenes, Timothy, Silvanus, Jude, John, Peter, James, etc., you know it. And because these persons feature regularly in the Gospels and the book of Acts, many Bible readers assume that these persons wrote the New Testament books bearing their name. As a teenager, I thought the same. It's sort of common sense, right? But ever since the New Testament writings were dispatched, however, theologians for a variety of reasons have questioned this assumption, especially from the late 18th century onwards. When I was doing my doctoral work, I found out that it was actually Edward Everson, a British clergyman, who was probably the very first who argued in print for the pseudonymity of certain New Testament books. In the literature, it's usually referred to Friedrich Schleiermacher. So the Germans could claim that they were the very first. It were the British. Always the British. So many, if not most, contemporary scholars believe that several New Testament books were not written by the ascribed authors, a widespread phenomenon in antiquity known as pseudonymity or pseudepigraphy. Now, both terms are used interchangeably in the literature, despite, I think, their respective focus on the name, pseudonymity, or the literature, pseudepigraphy. But I think, by definition, writings can only be considered pseudonymous or pseudepigraphal if the authors of a work are clearly indicated. We've thought about it during the conference. And so this is the case for 18 books in the New Testament, of which Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, the Pastorals, James, the Petrine Epistles, and Jude are most disputed for their authorship claim. Now, discussions about the origin of particular New Testament books is not a modern phenomenon. We have heard about it often during the conference. We could think of 2 Thessalonians, a letter written as though from us. We could think of Marcion, Basilides, and Tatian, who are said to have rejected some or all of the pastoral letters, either because they did not know them yet or because they disagreed with their contents. We have heard about 2 Peter. That was disputed. And by the 4th century, Eusebius reckoned James, Jude, and 2 Peter together with 2 John and 3 John among disputed writings. It seems that for Christians, the question of who wrote their authoritative writings became increasingly important in the second half of the 2nd century. when movements emerged that doctrinally differed from orthodoxy, and when the living memory that once linked present believers with Jesus' first followers started to fade away. Writing in the final quarter of the 2nd century, Irenaeus argued that true churches derived their legitimacy from the apostles, and this stimulated the invention of the category of the apostolic. I quote from Einar Thomason, "Special authority was given to texts that were thought to have been written by persons closely associated with the Savior himself and his disciples." End of quote. Following the tendency in the early church to see apostolicity as the main criterion for determining the status of religious texts, numerous writings were produced under the name of apostles, including Gospels and Acts, letters, Apocalypses. This required, so it seems, a new criterion to assign authoritative status to texts, as the sole criterion of apostolicity was no longer sufficient. The theological contents of writings led religious authorities to use the criterion of orthodoxy to serve as a kind of rule of faith, which could overrule apostolic authorship claims. Eusebius noted that, I quote, "one must not rely on the names of the apostles, but on the nature of the matters and the correctness of the ideas." End of quote. In addition to the criteria of apostolicity and orthodoxy, and there were more, as we have heard, the principle of tradition and consensus gave permanence to the boundaries of a New Testament canon. By the end of the 4th century, Augustine encouraged believers to, I quote, "prefer those writings that are received by all Catholic churches to those which some of them do not receive. Among those, again, which are not received by all, let him prefer those which the more numerous and the weightier churches receive to those which fewer and less authoritative churches hold." End of quote. It seems that authorities such as Athanasius or Epiphanius, as well as larger congregations in metropolitan centers such as Rome or Ephesus, had a greater influence on the acceptance of particular writings in the canon than lesser-known figures and smaller congregations in rural areas. Yet the widespread use of particular writings among these communities may well have been the most determinative factor in the process of early Christian canon formation. By the early 5th century, Jerome could write concerning the book of Hebrews, I quote, "The epistle which is inscribed to the Hebrews is received not only by the churches of the East, but also by all church writers of the Greek language before our days, as Paul the Apostle, though many think that it is from Barnabas or Clement. And it makes no difference whose it is, since it is from a churchman, and is celebrated in the daily readings of the church." End of quote. Jerome's comment that authorship should no longer be considered a decisive criterion does not imply that he or his colleagues at the time would allow pseudepigraphy in the New Testament. Hebrews could be accepted simply because it lacks an authorship claim. In the preface on his commentary on Philemon, Jerome notes that if this small letter was not written by Paul, as some claimed by the time, it could not have been included in the canon. Yet Paul must have written the letter to Philemon, otherwise it could never have been accepted by all churches. As Einar Thomason concludes, I quote, "There is no evidence whatsoever that Christian theologians in antiquity ever accepted as canonical a writing they positively thought was pseudepigraphical." End of quote. The aversion of religious authorities in early Christianity to include pseudepigraphy in the canon is, I think, at odds with the emerging consensus, as it is sometimes claimed, among contemporary scholars who argue on the basis of historical, literary, linguistic, or theological considerations that many writings in the New Testament are pseudonymous. It is very likely that if figures such as Irenaeus, Origen, Eusebius, or Jerome would have agreed with this conclusion, the New Testament would have looked differently, as they would simply not have allowed disputed writings to have canonical status. Now, how do contemporary scholars that this, I called it problem, but since yesterday I don't like using the word problem, maybe it's a tension, is best solved? Basically, 3 solutions have been proposed. First, the alleged pseudepigraphy of the New Testament should not necessarily be removed from the canon. Most advocates of this view stress that pseudepigraphy was a widely practiced and innocent literary convention in antiquity that should not be confused with modern notions of authorship. From this perspective, The authors of Judeo-Christian Pseudepigrapha were not deliberately writing forgeries to deceive people, but were consciously expanding on sacred tradition. A second solution is that some parts of the New Testament canon should be considered more important than others. This idea originates from Martin Luther. In his list of New Testament writings, 23 are numbered, followed by, after a blank line and without numbers, Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation. In his preface to Hebrews, Luther noted, I quote, "Up to this point we have had the true and chief books of the New Testament. The four which follow have from ancient times had a different reputation." End of quote. On Revelation he said, I quote, "I stick to the books which present Christ to me clearly and purely." End of quote. So it seems that for Luther, these writings did not have similar divine revelatory status, as they did not contain the central Christian message. A third and final position is that the canonical boundaries of the New Testament must actually be reconsidered. Robert Funk, for example, suggested to produce at least 3 New Testaments. One that only has the very basic truths about Jesus, as found in the Gospels and Paul, and which were preached in the early church. Second, one that contains the traditional 27 books of the New Testament, plus the saying Gospel of Q and the Gospel of Thomas. And 3, a New Testament that represents an entire library of Christian texts, including large collections of Gospels, Acts, letters, and apocalypses. Now, I believe, some of you may disagree, that none of these solutions have proven to be entirely satisfactory. Over the past 5 decades or so, a growing group of scholars has come to conclude that both direct and indirect sources in Greco-Roman, Christian, and I learned yesterday to a lesser extent, Jewish antiquity, demonstrate that false authorial claims were considered attempts to deceive and were understood as such by attentive audiences. The rise of authenticity criticism in the use of philological and historical methods to discriminate between authentic and inauthentic writings clearly attests of the notion of intellectual property. And the negative, if not violent, reactions against pseudepigraphers clearly show that it was anything but an innocent practice in antiquity. It may be, and I stress it may be, difficult to conclude otherwise that attempts to justify the presence of pseudepigrapha in the New Testament suffer shipwreck in light of the available historical evidence. Therefore, defining a canon within a canon seems a more attractive solution in dealing with alleged pseudepigrapha in the New Testament. Yet who determines what the central core of the New Testament is? To erect certain teachings as the only rulers against which others need to be measured also creates imbalance and one-sidedness, which I think impoverishes the Christian faith and life. The needs of the universal church over the centuries have varied, and the variety of traditions in the New Testament have answered to those needs. As long as the traditions point in the same direction and not away from one another, I think they can coexist in the same canon. And there is no need then to reduce or enlarge the New Testament either. History can simply not be redone. The Church has received the New Testament canon as it is today. And, quote again from Einar Thomason, apparently I liked his work, its sanctity is ultimately an effect of tradition. End of quote. But I would ask, which tradition? Does the authority to decide on the canonical boundaries of the New Testament lie in the traditions of the early church or in the traditions of modern critical scholarship? Because many of these traditions are part of the universal history of the church. The canon of the New Testament, and for me this is an important point, the canon of the New Testament is a product of history in general and a product of communities of faith in particular. And these communities of faith, I think both past and present, are the guardians of humanity's testimony to God's revelation in Christ. Now, if current solutions to the question what to do with pseudepigraphy in the New Testament, if there are any, are not entirely satisfactory, then how to proceed? Now I wish I could present the solution, which I don't have. So thanks for listening. No. By way of suggestion, I recommend contemporary communities of faith, including the scholarly communities of faith, maybe to learn from their ancient counterparts and, as I've called it, recycle some of the early and decisive criteria that have shaped the New Testament. First, the criterion of apostolicity. When the questions of canon emerged in the early church, the apostolic origin of writings was among the very first criteria to decide on the authoritative status of religious writings. But the underlying question of this criterion is very simply this: who is saying what? Maybe contemporary believers engaged in discussions of pseudepigraphy are recommended to ask the very same question. Who is arguing the case for the pseudonymity of a particular New Testament book? Is this a professing member of the church or someone outside the community of faith? This is not to say, of course, that the opinion or scholarly opinion of an outsider should be a priori dismissed. I just want to say that questions of canon are, I think, ultimately a concern of the church. And in addition, contemporary believers are recommended to recontextualize this criterion by asking maybe a follow-up question. Is this person arguing for the pseudonymity of a New Testament book an expert in his or her field of study? Matters of date and authorship of New Testament books are often discussed in New Testament introductions, of which there are plenty. So in this building, I guess. In many of these works, however, authors make claims about the provenance of New Testament writings while not having studied every single disputed book themselves in depth. Should not the opinion of those who have struggled with the introductory matters of individual New Testament writings in monographs and peer-reviewed articles be given higher esteem? Second, the criterion of tradition. This criterion has proven to be a determinative factor in the process of early Christian canon formation. When particular books were used by many churches, they apparently proved their worth to these communities of faith. Taking the criterion of apostolicity also into account, contemporary believers are also recommended to ask the question: is the opinion of professing experts a majority position in the field of New Testament studies? Now, the notion of the majority position is often used in authorship discussions of New Testament books, but usually as a rhetorical device. By the end of the 20th century, for example, Raymond Brown, famous Catholic scholar, New Testament scholar, estimated that 80 to 90% of New Testament scholars considered the letters to Timothy and Titus to be pseudonymous. 60 to 80% of them agreed on the pseudonymity of Colossians and Ephesians, respectively, according to Brown. Such percentages rhetorically add force to the case for the pseudonymity, as they banish those who believe in the authenticity of disputed Pauline letters to the desert. But interestingly, when Paul Foster would put Brown's claims to the test during an annual conference in the British New Testament Society in 2011, it appeared that 55 to 57% of the more than 100 respondents believed in the pseudonymity of the pastorals, and only 39 and 60% of the respondents indicated to consider Ephesians and Colossians, respectively, pseudonymous. Now, whatever value there is in such statistics, I think the pseudonymity of a particular New Testament book should best be given serious consideration when a significant number of professing experts has argued for its case. The final criterion of orthodoxy, before I close. The criterion of orthodoxy once emerged in order to overrule false claims to apostolic authorship. When a significant number of professing experts has argued for the pseudonymity of a certain New Testament book, contemporary believers are recommended to recontextualize the criterion of orthodoxy by asking the question: which portions of this book are found attested in undisputed parts of the New Testament canon. This does not necessarily require the identification of a central core in early Christian teaching, as with the canon approach, but simply to use the anonymous and undisputed canonical books as guidelines. The Gospels, Acts, the Epistle to the Hebrews, and 1 to 3 John can theoretically not be considered pseudepigrapha, as they do not disclose their authors. And the Pauline authorship of Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon is beyond any serious scholarly doubt anno today. So why not use these writings as a touchstone to see how orthodox or unorthodox disputed writings are? As long as theological expressions resonate with those of the undisputed writings, why bother about the alleged pseudonymity of disputed writings? In 2nd Thessalonians, for example, I think any theological statement can be found that is not voiced by Paul in his undisputed letters. I think there's more about Satan that is not voiced by Paul elsewhere. By way of conclusion, in the unfolding process of canon formation in early Christianity, the criteria of apostolicity, orthodoxy, and tradition were decisive in shaping what is known as the New Testament. As such, the canon is both a product of history and a product of communities of faith. And those early communities of faith would never have accepted exposed pseudepigrapha to be part of the New Testament canon. And when modern scholars insist on the pseudonymity of particular New Testament books, they clearly disagree with the overall judgment of their ancient colleagues. Those who justify the presence of pseudepigrapha in the New Testament by arguing that pseudepigraphy was an innocent practice in antiquity, I think face difficulties in light of the many ancient sources that prove the contrary. The search for a canon within the canon, as well as the idea to enlarge or reduce the New Testament, each have their own difficulties as well. Obviously, the most easy solution is to give up the idea that there are pseudepigraphal writings in the New Testament. But this will cause dissatisfaction among many contemporary scholars as well, I think. So whatever solution one prefers, if there is any, it is important to be reminded of the fact that the New Testament is a product of history and a product of communities of faith. And the boundaries of the New Testament canon are not an exclusive concern of the early church, nor the modern academy, but of the universal church of all ages, including its communities of faith, including its scholarly communities of faith. And these communities, both past and present, are the guardians of humanity's testimony to God's revelation in Christ. By way of suggestion, I recommend contemporary communities of faith to learn from their ancient counterparts and try to recycle the criteria of apostolicity, orthodoxy, and tradition by asking the same questions that were once asked to set the boundaries of the New Testament canon. First, who is it that argues for the pseudonymity of particular New Testament books? Second, does he or she share an ecclesial concern? Third, is he or she a specialist in that particular field? 4, does he or she represent the majority position? And 5, how does the contents of an alleged pseudepigraphon relate to undisputed parts of the New Testament? Thank you.
We've got time for some questions for Jermo. Randy?
Jermo, thank you for a wonderful paper. The Criterion of Tradition, it's accepted by the communities of faith, I would say over several hundred years. What I hear from my students, particularly, for instance, is they want to take the snapshot of the last 10 years or whatever. So it would be interesting to apply that criterion to say, well, what does the majority of communities of faith think worldwide for several hundred years about the topic? How would you react to that?
Yeah, I think I would agree that it is important to take into account all those ages of research, and in that regard, I think the majority position, as it is claimed in the literature, has emerged only in the past 200 years. But if we would take the position of commentators and theologians over the past 20 centuries, I think the majority position would agree on the authenticity of most, if not all, of the New Testament writings. I think we should take that into account.
Very good. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm wondering about one of the books that was included in special consideration for a period of time. You find it in Codex Alexandrinus, First Clement, for example. It's certainly orthodox and it's well within the Christian tradition, but it was included for a while and then it was not. So would you give priority at that point to apostolicity or to widespread use? It certainly had some use for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Could I say that underlying the question is the canon theoretically open or closed? I am inclined to say that theoretically the canon is open, although I would say it's not desirable nor practical to add books to it, even if they are orthodox or not. And so in this case, I would confine myself to the 27 that we eventually got, at least in the Protestant canon. And we learned yesterday that was a messy process. I agree on that, but I say let's receive the 27 of the Protestant canon.
Yeah.
So in that regard.
But initially, that was not the case in the early churches for several centuries. There was not 27 books that all agreed to well into the centuries later, and as late as the 8th, 9th century, you'll find some variations as well as the 1800s in the churches.
Yes, you're right. I was reading also in Bruce Metzger's excellent book on the New Testament canon, and he has in his appendix at the end, he has for the first 4 centuries, he has all these canon lists, and I think there's not one the same. But it shows that the early church was not agreed, as modern scholarship is not agreed. But my personal struggle is, you want to respect those both traditions, and in the end, you want to be obedient to the tradition as we have received it in our own Bibles, and in the Protestant canon is 27. Let's leave it there. But now, if the discussion comes up also among professing experts that there might be pseudepigrapha in the New Testament, then I think we should take that seriously and consider whether there in fact are pseudepigrapha in the New Testament, and how exactly to deal with that. That continues to be a struggle, but I've tried to think of some guidelines in how to deal with it, especially in comparing them with undisputed writings.
Okay. Question, Paul?
Thanks so much, Jermo. Think about the Jesus Seminar and the 5th Gospel, Thomas, and kind of, creating a canon. Of course, they were declaring, this is not theological, it's only historical, on these bases. Yeah. But then they did theological interpretation based upon Thomas. And so the question of, who determines canon? I had some dialogue with Marcus Borg on this in a journal a few years ago, and had another critique saying, wait a minute, Jesus Seminar cannot say this is canonical without the church approving it as a part of the canon. And so what do we do with scholarship that might challenge or declare a new canon outside of the parameters of the church?
Sometimes I don't know also is a good answer. Good point. Yeah.
And this is, again, some of my Second Temple Judaism stuff I've been reading more recently. There really is a concerted effort, especially I'm thinking about among scroll scholars, they're thinking about reworked Pentateuch, And so the notion of competitive textuality and so forth, that a lot of scholars are trying to break down the parameters of even authoritative, let alone canonical kind of texts. So I think, and this has mostly to do with Old Testament scholars who are working in the scrolls, who are saying, look, this idea of canon is anachronistic anyhow. Let's just say that reworked Pentateuch was authoritative at Qumran, so is Pentateuch that was authoritative at Qumran. So at least in some of my reading that I found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, part of the way that that's been addressed is a complete leveling of the playing field. And let's just call these all ancient texts that were influential in communities in various ways, which I think problematizes your question, because I don't know that the church can function in a bland secularization of the entirety of the authoritative text that has formed the church. So, how's that for a non-answer?
Steve and then.
So, which Steve? Oh.
Stephen.
Just a follow-up question from 2 questions ago. You had said that the consensus view, the historical consensus was that the canon, the letters in the canon were, you said, authentic, and I was curious how you differentiate authenticity from authoritative, in the sense of, canon is ascribing authority that I don't know necessarily would make a historical claim about authenticity, and maybe there isn't a distinction in your mind between those two.
No, I would say that, well, and I'm not sure if I see this correctly, but can't you sort of discern a progression in the criteria emerging, and that it started with apostolicity, and when there were other documents circulating under apostolic names, it was necessary that another criterion like orthodoxy or consensus emerged in order to sort of counter that. But I think that the notion of authority was in the beginnings very much associated with the apostolic.
For sure.
Yeah, yeah.
I agree.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Steve Wall.
Thank you. My question is, could the process you're describing ever happen? Because it would need an ecumenical council to do this. And I just can't imagine Rome, the Orthodox, in their various forms, Protestantism, Pentecostalism, getting together and agreeing that Titus is pseudonymous.
mm-hmm.
I just can't see it happening. So, is your discussion entirely theoretical?
You mean in terms of the progression of the emergence of the criteria?
As to whether these criteria could ever be used.
Mm-hmm. But as the church fathers do describe them, you can see that there were some sort of criteria used in the discussions, in seeking boundaries of a collection of authoritative texts.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, my question is, could we ever change that today?
No.
And I'm saying I just can't see that ever happening.
Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say that they need to be changed.
Ah, okay.
But then I've expressed myself unclearly. Sorry.
Yeah,
But
okay.
yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah,
That's helpful.
yeah.
Now, the breadth of the Christian movement across the world is, how would you have that kind of connection? In the United States, there are 30,000 Protestant groups. So how do you get those folks?
You could do it on Zoom.
You can do it on Zoom. Yeah, Murray in the back, yeah.
Yeah, thanks again, Jim. Really interesting. I wonder if there's something missing out in our discussion that might help us, which is in talking about apostolicity and tradition and or
Catholicity.
Or an orthodoxy. We're talking about the criteria the church used over a process of time, I'd say, to recognise the canon. I think we should avoid the language of forming the canon or creating the canon. What's going on is the church is recognising the canon, because surely the canon is a theological idea that these are inspired texts given by God. That's how the churches receive them. So if that's the case, then we've got to somehow factor in the inspiration issue as well. I don't think it solves it for us.
No, but isn't the I don't know. Am I correct to say that the idea of sort of inspiration was quite late in church history? Wasn't it Jerome or Augustine who sort of noticed that, and in the sense that it was not because the writings are inspired, therefore they have become canonical. It is writings were apostolic, and therefore they were inspired, in that order. But I'm not sure if I see this correctly.
Yeah, I only get the inspiration, at least in embryonic form, in Paul. 2 Timothy 3 and 2 Peter. So if what we mean by inspiration is divine action through human mediation.
But do we have evidence in earlier, like in 2nd or 3rd century, that the idea of inspiration was important in discussions about canon? I don't know. It's an open question.
Yeah, good question.
Michael, I think you last one, and then we need to move on for Steve.
The last one. This might end in a fizzle. I wonder, as a lifelong Protestant Baptist, if there's, and I don't have a tidy solution, but I just wonder if something's fundamentally missing in our processes that we could learn from other communions here. The relationship between canon and tradition, the weight of tradition in the church, understanding the Spirit working in that very process. You hint at this a little bit in your paper, I think. But then we get bogged down on authority very quickly, apostolicity, just as it was a standalone or something like that, not part of. And then look at the history, and the history is much messier. You know, these books here, these books there, and to this day, different canons that are still used around the world. So without saying this solves anything, I think theologically, the wrestling with how tradition works in relation to canon and ecclesiology, I think, is something that can't be avoided.
And this is part of the imperfection of my paper. Yeah.
The whole darn thing.
Yeah. Very good. Let's thank Jermo. We'll have a bit of a tech break here as Steve joins us. Everything. I think it was last.